share my screen. Okay. Great, so let's get started. The topic of today's lecture is user stories and wireframes. So the goal of today will be to talk a little bit about how you go about creating your initial idea, right? So how do we take that first step of a wireframe of getting a concept that actually solves a problem for the customer and figuring out how to lay that out. After we do that, we're going to run through Balsamiq a little bit and just get you all acquainted to how that works. And that will prepare you for next week, where the major assignment will be to create a wireframe on Balsamiq and then present that to the class. And that'll be your first real graded assignment. Okay. So any questions before we move forward? Either questions about last lecture or...
What do you mean about first real graded assignment?
So the other assignments are really whether or not you did them, and they feed into your participation, whereas this one will actually have a letter grade.
Thank you.
Okay. So moving forward, let's talk a little bit for the next 10, 15 minutes, lean startup reading. So first question, does anyone want to volunteer an answer to what is an MVP? Talked a little bit about this yesterday or last week, sorry. And obviously the reading is a lot about that. So who wants to talk about what an MVP is? You know, not just the definition of what does the acronym stand for, but what does it mean to you after going through this reading? Mary, I see you've got your hand up.
The acronym is minimum value product. What that is, it's the initial step. So it's like, it's kind of like a prototype meets a beta test in my mind, in that it's the initial step for creating this vision and how it's going to become feasible in terms of like a workflow and combining that idea into a business model in it, more or less.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. The only thing I would say is instead of value, V is viable. So what we're really, and the reason I emphasize that is because we're really looking for what is the minimum amount needed to create something that will be useful, right? So in that case, viable is sort of a placeholder for useful to the customer. So we'll talk a little bit about that in later slides, but it's sort of what is the most basic possible thing that we could put out to customers that would demonstrate to them the problem that you're trying to solve and what that solution would be. Pablo, I see that your hand is up as well.
Yeah, I had a question. So during the reading, they were emphasizing on not overcomplicating the MVP. Is there any pros to overcomplicating other than you have more to start with once you know what direction you want to go in?
You said any pros to overcomplicating?
Yeah, like overdeveloping a product that may or may not take off.
You know, I would say in general, no, right? So if we're talking about overdeveloping before getting that to any sort of customer, I would say that is generally taken as a bad thing. However, if we're going to search for why might we do that, if we're trying to be in stealth mode, if we don't want people to know about what we're doing, that could be a reason to develop a lot before putting it out there into the customer's hands. Another reason might be if you or your team are the customers, then sometimes you don't need to do that. A good example of that is Slack. Does anyone know the story of how Slack got started? So it's kind of an interesting story. The founders of Slack were actually building a game. and it was sort of a game for gamers. It was very deep in the weeds. They had some very passionate users, but they were never really able to get past those initial early adopters. However, they ended up developing Slack as an internal communication mechanism because they realized for them that email and texting just wasn't quite doing it. So it was never really meant to be used by customers. It was just something that they were using for each other. But eventually their game failed. And when it came time to decide, do we just fold up shop and get different jobs, or do we try to keep going, maybe pivot to something? They realized that what they had actually was working pretty well and might be something worth selling. And that's how Slack was created. So in that sense, they really overdeveloped within the team, but they were their own customers. So that could be an example where it can be beneficial to develop something more fully in-house, because you realize that the people in-house are actually pretty good representatives of who their customers are going to be. Does that answer your question? So I think the main takeaway there is that you really want to iterate with some kind of user. So that user could be internal. However, it doesn't necessarily, if it's internal, it should mean that those people are really going to allow you to keep making the product better, right? So that they should be representative of your general customers. I see a couple items in the chat. So Tyler said, if a lot of capital is required. So that means that, actually, Tyler, do you want to maybe talk about that?
Yeah, sure. When Pablo brought up the idea of the cons of overdeveloping a product or an MVP, I would think that the capital required to do that would probably be a con. And also, it'll be less of an opportunity for investors to really imagine what they would want more in a product. That was something I saw in the reading. Like, he said that investors would most likely want a product that's 80% done, so there's more freedom to imagine what they would want to include in a final product.
Yeah, for sure. I would say that the amount of capital that you need in order to further develop the product, I think the less likely that you're going to be to want to develop everything up front before sharing it with the customers, because you're really going to want to make sure that you are right about how the customers are going to receive your product before you roll it out. But if your cost to developing is low, and if you feel like you're pretty good at it, and cost is also a function of time, so you're going to be able to do a lot in a quick amount of time before rolling out to customers, then that can be okay. But one thing to keep in mind is that most of us, not all of us, but most of us, including myself, have a tendency to want to perfect something before we release it to the public, right? We want to have a really good assignment before we submit it. We want to have our essay edited and all of that before we submit the final graph for grading. So we have to fight that tendency. And that's, I think, why a lot of lean thinking is pretty adamant that we need to get our product out to the customers earlier than we're comfortable, because there's very few people who are going to be naturally driven to want to get something out there prematurely or too early. So, that the instinct that you're usually fighting is against overdeveloping, because you're going to want to just keep perfecting before giving it to customers to see. And then Kavya, you mentioned video game. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Oh, that was just in reference to like where Slack came from.
Mm-hmm.
And how I just remember basically what you said on how it was more for internal communication in the game, and then they ended up spinning that off into the company instead.
Yeah. And when you posted that, it made me think that, yeah, actually video games are a good example where it needs to be a little bit more complete. You can't just be like, hey, look, I got this new way to make a player jump. right? And then that's all you do, right? There needs to be some sort of beginning, middle, end, some way to win, some way to lose in a video game. So those do require a little bit more upfront development.
Yeah, I did actually write about that in the assignment for today because I picked a digital health app that was a video game. So I actually talked about how you would need like a basic level as your MVP.
Great. Yeah. So what types of MVPs are there? Maybe Kavya, since you mentioned the one that you picked, I believe that was Akili Interactive. Talk a little bit about what type of MVP that is and why you chose that as the type.
I think initially I just said I guess very elementary stage could be like just a video itself, kind of similar to how I think one of the other companies did. I forget which one. And then just to show, like, in that case, they were comparing it to a different treatment. So just a video of like what the outcome would be for patients that were on the standard of care treatment versus this new video game app treatment instead. And then I spoke about how it would be a level, but I didn't really classify. So I started off with a video mainly.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So it's sort of using that video to get the point across.
Because it's I spoke more about like how that would be more useful in the beginning, just to show like potential early adopters the value of the product.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Since it's
Especially
like
with something like
space.
that, where there's a lot of complexity to it, right? I think it's difficult to create just one killer app feature within that space of let's have sort of a gamified digital therapy. So having a video could be a good way to get people excited about it without having to overdevelop, right? You can at least see before you start that massive amount of capital that might be required to create that product. To Tyler's early point, you can start by just showing that video to your potential customers, whether that be providers or patients, maybe even payers, to see, hey, if you could get this to work, would they buy in? So that's a good example. There were a few other video examples in the assignments. Would anyone else like to talk about their videos? See, Jeanette, you're raising your hand.
I actually didn't choose a product that was a video MVP. I chose something that was the Concierge MVP, where like you pick your first customer and then you kind of adopt your MVP based on their preferences and their feedback. So I did mine off Sephora, and Sephora is like really known for it's a makeup brand that's known for like personalization and helping their customers find like the ideal product that they're looking for. So I chose to look at it in the sense of a Concierge MVP, where you would like your first adopter and then determine what types of personalization that they would want, whether it's like shade matching or if it's price range, like what type of price ranges they're looking forward to, and then move forward in your website development based off of what they were expressing that they wanted.
I like that. I like the closeness to customers that you mentioned. A good corollary to that is Airbnb. The story with Airbnb is that, well, sort of let's skip ahead a little bit to they've already started the company and they have some users, and they've actually been accepted into one of the more prestigious startup incubators out there called Y Combinator. And so they'd been accepted, and one of the leaders at Y Combinator asked them, who are your customers? And they kind of sheepishly said, well, we don't have many. And he says, well, how many do you have? And they said, well, we've got like 10. And the leader asked, where are they? They said, New York. And the leader said, well, why are you here? They were in San Francisco. And so he booked them a flight to New York and said, get over there, talk to your customers. So it's kind of one of those interesting things where even if you only have 10 customers, if you can really delight them and give them exactly what they need, that could be the beginning of something great. Because then those 10 people might tell 10 others, hey, this Airbnb thing or this new beauty care personalized line is really cool. You should get in on this. And then that's how you can get that exponential growth. And if you're growing exponentially, you can go from 10 users to 10,000 to 10 million before you even know it. So it's a good example where that concierge model can really help grow your startup in a really effective way by concentrating on what those customers really are looking for and what's missing, not only from your competitors, but maybe from your own product that you can start to build on. Let's go back to videos. One interesting thing that I noticed with videos, at least among the people who submitted, was they all tended to be pretty ambitious ideas. So we already have, Kavya mentioned Akili Interactive, right? Where it's a digital therapeutic and that's going to require a lot of upfront investment. The other examples I have are Uber, Meta, or specifically Instagram, and then Apple. So you can imagine about as ambitious as you get. Would anyone like to talk about, is there a connection there between how ambitious an idea is and your movement to make your MVP a video? I see Mary's raising her hand.
Yeah, it's interesting when you connect to the complexity, because my mind immediately goes to, I forgot it, it's a startup website, Kickstarter.
Mhm.
So a lot of those startups, they have these very complex ideas, and you go to the very simple Kickstart page and it's just a video. Some of them are just like, maybe it's the CEO or the founder explaining and talking through the product. Some of them even have like PowerPoints with some cool animations. And I've even seen more like for a heads-up display, an actual like video of it working and like interfacing it. And at the end, it's just like, cool idea, donate here.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a nice and easy way to explain something that's complex, that if you had maybe like what we're doing, like a wireframe of a website or a basic outline for a website, a lot of that information is going to be lost to your customer.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that example. It's something I hadn't thought of before. We have a few great platforms, Kickstarter, one of the most well-known, that you can post your video to get people excited about your idea. The example from the Lean Startup chapter was Dropbox, but that required a little bit of existing social capital, right? In that case, Drew Houston he was sort of a known person within this, I think, like hackers community. And so by posting his video there, and they happened to be exactly who they wanted to be the early adopters, he was able to get a lot of traction for Dropbox. But I think Kickstarter is a great example where it's more accessible to everybody. If you've got a great concept and you can make a video about it, you can really get people to rally around that concept and not only become funders, but also become potential users. So I think that's a great example of how you might execute on this video that you've made, because a video might not be enough if you took it into a VC or angel investor meeting and that's all you had. It might not be enough to convince anyone to hand you money, but it could certainly be enough for Kickstarter. And then you can show this is how many people had interest when you were to go to an actual investor meeting. And then that might get them excited of, hey, I not only have this video, but I also have, a few dozen, few hundred people who are interested. Tyler, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I'm mainly going along with what Mary said. Is there's probably a correlation between like ambitious ideas and having the freedom to really show how the product works and having the freedom to do so in a video. Like you can make a video on whatever you want, but as long as it shows your idea, and that idea can be a little bit more abstract. Like in the case of Dropbox, people might not even know what, like how to picture the product. So having a medium to do that, I think correlates well with ambitious ideas.
Yep, absolutely. So let's talk about another one. We talked a little bit about Concierge just now with Jeanette's MVP example. Did anyone else do a Concierge example that they'd like to share? What about Alec?
Yeah, so I just kind of listed it as like an example of a potential strategy to use for my product. So I was doing Nike. What I said was that they could use like recycled materials. I guess this would kind of be a low quality one, MVP as well. Just to kind of target that, you know, eco-friendly consumer, not using like a lot of high tech, possibly, just because it's kind of can be wasted resources and time, as mentioned in the reading. But for that concierge model, I just said that they could gauge how effective going the strategy could be towards these consumers. It was just like a kind of like a possibility for that. So yeah.
Yeah, I like that example because, you know, going up against Nike or trying to be the next Nike can be very difficult, right? Super ambitious again, but also when we're talking shoes, like what's a video really going to give you? So I liked the idea of going concierge on that. And then how might you target your concierge product? Would you look for a certain audience or certain location? What might that look like?
I was thinking possibly, I don't know, through like a web, digital, maybe through like surveys or gauging off that, looking up like if you can do like search history of like eco-friendly recycled products, because I know a lot of shoe companies are going towards that, like Adidas as well. I know there's other shoe companies that are going that direction. Maybe just to see off like how popular, you know, like recycled products, eco-friendly products are towards like those types of consumers.
Sure. Yeah. And it's interesting because a company like Adidas or Nike, you know, obviously they absolutely dwarf you in terms of the amount of capital and resources and even design talent that they could put into something like this. But they're not going to actually follow their customers around. It's just not cost effective for them. So that's an area where you actually have a distinct advantage to where you could follow these customers around in a concierge way and figure out what really is driving them. What do they really want? And have them tell you, and then incorporate that into your model. And then that might enable you to hit upon something truly innovative, right? You know, we could think sort of a generation prior to that where, you know, Tom's became a very successful model of, you know, having every shoe purchase going towards helping someone in a developing country. And so that can really be something that where you can innovate in a way that those larger behemoths could never think of. And by going concierge, you can find out, hey, what actually works with this target demographic? What do they want to see? And how can you fulfill that? Anyone else on concierge?
I also did a concierge. I kind of looked at it through a lens of, well, Fitbit in 2009 before they, you know, came, or like before fitness trackers came big in say like 2015. And my minimum viable product would be a kind of like a little iPod shuffle, basically, that you would like clip to your belt that would say, you know, how many steps, how many calories, and what time it was. And, you know, once you released this basic product, you could release it to, you know, all markets, but then kind of hone in and do market testing afterwards to see what different markets are looking for different characteristics or aspects of a product. And then from that, you can develop different product lines. So say maybe a more fashionable product line or one that has heart rate monitoring or whatnot.
Yeah, I like that, going very simple. maybe picking a certain target demographic that maybe is unique in some way, shape, or form. And then you can sort of give them your Fitbit shuffle or whatever that might be. So you have an automatic customer and you can just figure out, okay, how can you do better than the incumbents in the industry? So I think that really could work. And Fitbit, or more broadly, Internet of Things, I think are really starting to become a buzzy area within digital health. It's how can we start to connect these tools that a lot of patients are using on a daily basis, whether that be glucose monitors, heart monitors, even brain monitors, and connect that to an easy to use interface, such as what Fitbit has come up with, Apple has come up with as well. And that's another thing, is you can really focus sometimes on the interface, right? Sometimes what these devices are doing are pretty basic. And let's say that you wanted to come up with a with like a Internet of Things prototype for the end of this class. You don't really have to worry about the how am I going to measure heart rate, how am I going to measure steps and all that. Just assume that that's something you can buy, because it is becoming a little bit of a commodity. And where your innovation will be is in that interface. How do you make an interface that people will want to use, that will keep them engaged, and that will help them to live healthier lives? Great. Thanks so much for that. How about the Wizard of Oz MVP? I noticed that, Mary, you put that in the chat. Anyone want to comment on the Wizard of Oz? Or did anyone have an example that used that?
I did mine on it.
Great. Let's hear about it.
So the Wizard of Oz is when you're taking your MVP and you're giving it upfront to potential customers. I liked it because when I was reading it, coming from a med device background, it helped me differentiate between what we call a beta product and a beta test. So the MVP is used for beta test, where you're testing your product with potential customers to get a sample set of, and kind of that logic kind of ties with the Concierge MVP too, versus the beta product is more or less what your final product's going to look like. And that's completely in the downstream process of design. So that being said, this kind of takes that logic of, this might not be what your final product's going to look like, but it's a good blueprint of it. And I chose Chegg. Chegg.com is a website that offers all of these different learning tools, tutoring, solutions manuals, textbooks. So I modeled it off of that, and I said, how can I strip this product down to what I would think would be the bare minimum? And that would be providing textbooks and solutions, and taking that and testing to see, for students at different stages in their education, is this something, providing these e-textbooks at a reasonable rate, is this something that's going to benefit them and solve the problem of giving students help, easy access to help for their classes, and empower them, give the power of their learning back to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like sort of that differentiation between a beta test and a beta product, and how, one can lead to the other. Anyone else on the Wizard of Oz? Okay, I'll just, to close that question out, almost every startup has some level of Wizard of Oz within their workflow, right? And the reason is because it's hard to just automate everything at once. And so sometimes, in order to get the traction, in order to sometimes figure out what it is that you even need to automate to improve your product to the next level, you have to do a lot of it yourself. and do it manually, just so that you can get through that to the next phase. So there's a lot of Wizard of Ozing going on at almost every startup. It's almost like I hate the term fake it till you make it, because you really have to provide something of substance in order to make it. But there is a lot of sort of making things look automated, even if there's a lot of people behind the scenes doing the work in a manual fashion. And that's just to get everything to work in the first place, because you can't automate everything at once. Kevin, I see your hands up.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was wondering if that Wizard of Oz testing or product, does it require the customer to know that it's not a beta test? Because I think in video games, you see it a lot, right? Or they release something and it's kind of technically broken because they want to just test it out and they have to meet business demands.
Yeah. Sometimes it sort of depends. If you're a startup and this is all you've got, then sometimes there's not really any need to say that you're beta testing. If you're a larger, more established software or company in general, then you kind of want to put that disclaimer on so as not to hurt your brand. So that can definitely be a thing. Also, sometimes putting that disclaimer on that, hey, we're in beta, and if you attach to that, please give us suggestions, then that can be a great way to get feedback from your customers and get that concierge treatment going. So that way you can have even a blend of a few of the different models. Maybe you've got Wizard of Oz and concierge going, because not only are you sort of faking a little bit just to make it work, but you are also listening to feedback of the customer and trying to use that to make your product even better. Now, you mentioned, Kevin, that sometimes this happens in video games. So it sounds like you have some intimate familiarity with this. Could you maybe talk a little bit about one area where you experienced this? And maybe we could try to tie that to this next question of why release an imperfect product?
Well, I think there's two sides of this. One is you release a beta, saying that it's a beta, and it was resounding success. It was much better than anyone expected.
Mm-hmm.
And then it actually builds up your brand and perception, and you get a lot of hype on it. On the opposite end, I forgot what the latest, what's it called? Cyberpunk is another video game that was released, finished, and it was a horrible. They got sued a lot. And I think that's probably leads into your next question, which is why release an imperfect product? And I believe from reading all the news and everything, it's business pressure.
Interesting. Yeah. So I could see that in one way, right? It's if you are being pressured to, hey, we need to get version 2 out there, the sequel, maybe keeping up with the Joneses, right? Our main competitor just released a new version. And now we have.
Sorry, can you repeat that? I think your internet cut off.
Oh, can you all hear me? So sometimes if you have to keep up with your competitor, that can lead to business pressures to release an imperfect product. But there are good reasons to release an imperfect product as well. Sometimes we just need to learn, and we need to be okay with releasing something that maybe we're even a little bit embarrassed about, because that's the only way that we are going to understand how to make it the best possible product for our customers. Now, some maybe caveats that we can get put in place are to call it a beta, or maybe to only release it to a limited audience that we know is not going to lead to this huge media firestorm or trashing of the game or the product. So there are ways that you can limit your risk there. Leilani, I see that your hand's up.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of put my thoughts about the imperfect product. I think it's a great way for companies to get feedback from customers as well, and getting that user experience so they can implement a new version of it. And as well as a company, I feel like that would be a great way for investors to continue investing into the product too, because like I also looked into Fitbit for the assignment, and like they started off with something very minimal, and then they started adding like the clock display and everything like that, and that's how like they were able to like get more like customers to like buy their products. So I think that's like a benefit of like starting off with an imperfect like product.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it can be very tempting, put yourself in the shoes of the developers of Fitbit. Once you get going on their basic MVP, it can be tempting to think, oh, well, this would be so much better if it had a clock, right? Or what if we had all these different metrics? Or what if we were measuring heart rate and steps? But if we get caught in that, we'll never end up releasing, because we'll always think of great ideas of what we can add on to that. And so that's, the whole, well, you know what, once we have that basic MVP, let's release it then, maybe to a limited audience, but let's at least get that to an audience so that they can tell us what the next thing is that they want. Because oftentimes we'll get caught up thinking, we know the best, we're the developers, we're doing the product, we know what to create, but oftentimes that's not correct. We really need to work in tandem with the customers or the users of our product. That's the only way that we're going to know what our next moves should be in terms of product development. Anyone else have a thought on this question of why release an imperfect product?
Isn't perfect relative to the stage of development you're at?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, first off, there's no such thing as a perfect product. So it's relative to perfection, which is not really achievable. But you're completely right that it is also going to depend on what stage you're at, right? And also what stage you are in as a company. If you are a very well-established company, right? Apple, they released Apple Maps about 10 years ago. And that was really an accomplishment, but it was not as good as Google Maps, and it got some people lost, myself included, and they really kind of got burned on that. And, I will never use Apple Maps, even though I have an iPhone. It'll sometimes direct me to Apple Maps. I immediately quit and go to Google because I just don't want to get burned on that anymore. So the level of perfection that was required to release a Maps app was a lot higher than it would have been to maybe release something that's maybe the competition is not as stiff, or maybe you're a little bit less of an incumbent, right? So maybe less is expected of you, but you can do one aspect of it really well, right? Waze is a good example where at the beginning they didn't have the best routes, but they had a different way of going about it, a little bit more of a crowdsourced approach. And so people used Waze, even though it wasn't quite as good as Google Maps in terms of accuracy, but it offered a new way to figure out your route. And so that can factor in too. It's how different is what you're trying to do from the competition. If the answer is very, very, very different, the standards of perfection are lower than, we're just trying to compete against everyone else and do the same thing that's already being done.
They're also, at the time, from the business side of that, they were losing a lot of customers to Google. At that time, if you look at the sales for the iPhone versus an Android, the Android spiked, and the sales for a short period of time for Apple iPhones went down. And when they were released Apple Maps, their sales started to climb up. So in an established company, don't you have to weigh in? Does launching an imperfect or not as polished product going to be better financially for your company in the long run?
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes back to a point that we made a bit earlier about sometimes the company feels pressured to release the new release. So it's not just with games where that can definitely lead to trouble, but also with, more functional apps like Apple Maps, Google Maps, trying to make sure that what you've got is going to compete with your competitor. And, some of the most established companies in the world right now have pretty high profile failures along those lines, right? Amazon, they decided that they needed to get into the phone business. And so they created their Amazon phone as a complete flop, right? So sometimes it's also the opportunity is so great that it's worth it even if it fails. And I think that might have been part of what Apple was thinking there and what Amazon was thinking as well of, you know, if we're only making bets that are going to succeed, then we're not being daring enough. And we might be missing the opportunity to capture that next great business. Okay, would anyone else, this is a great point to get your participation in. Would anyone like to share their assignments? I know we've had a few, but give you all any last chance, particularly if you haven't participated yet, to share what you covered for your MVP. Hassan.
Hey, Professor. Yeah, I chose Strava. I thought it's a pretty cool app where you can track a lot of your activities, everything from like running all the way up to like canoeing and things like that, rock climbing. It's really, really neat. And I thought for, you know, if I was the founder and I was to create the MVP, I would probably start out as something like running, and then just tracking the amount of time that you go for. And then you can kind of, as you build and you measure and you learn, can kind of branch into, you know, tracking the route and then being able to see the intricacies of the route, being able to figure out how to implement a hybrid and a satellite map to be able to see, like, you know, instead of the road layout, like you would see in like Google Maps, you'd be able to see, you know, the actual foliage, the trees, the houses and things like that. And then you could extrapolate that and then push that into other sorts of outdoor activities as well. And so you'd start out with that basic concept and then kind of build from there. And what's cool is that it's driven by metrics, driven by a lot of numbers. And so the more that you have, the more people you have using it, the more data you're able to get. And then you can also get performance metrics from it later down the line, and be able to see, you know, and be able to tailor recommendations of things like recovery and the amount of exertion you're doing. Once you have like a lot more data and things like that, that would be a lot further down the line. But yeah, that was my idea for the MVP if I was to start the company from scratch.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. I like that because it's another variation of the concierge of let's try to build for one specific audience, right? And that also kind of gets into what we were talking about of, you know, imperfection, perfection is all relative, right? If we are focused on a very specific audience that may be underserved for their specific needs, right? Then we can have a little bit more leeway with our imperfect MVP. You know, let's say we're gonna pick something very niche, like not just running, but you know, hill running, right? People who love to run up hills. And so we focus really closely on elevation gain, you know, maybe showing them all the different hills in their region, right? So we could focus even tight hill running in Los Angeles. So, hey, here are the best hills that you can run up in LA. Then that gives you an advantage that none of the incumbents are going to compete with you on. And so you've now carved out this little niche for yourself, and you can use that to have more interactions with actual customers who can help you develop your product to become even better. And then suddenly you might find yourself in a position to really compete with the incumbents. So it's sort of like creating those channels that you can go into that give you a little bit of buffer against the competition and enable you to develop something truly innovative.
Yeah, awesome.
Anyone else? Julie.
Hi. So I did my company, CocaCola.
Mhm.
And so for this one, what I would take into account first when starting out this this company in theory, would be that I would, for the MVP, I would consider for this company to come up with a hypothesis first based off what I think the public would like, and then come up sort of with a set of characteristics and parameters for the drink, such as being carbonated, caffeinated, having a lot of sugar. And then since so the reading emphasized the idea of not being wasteful and sort of being able to, I guess, get over the hurdle of having a lot of costs in the short term, I would create a small amount of soda, even if in the short term it may be expensive and it would take a lot of time to produce on such a small scale. And then from there, I would sort of try to test it out in like a single grocery store and sort of give out samples. And then from there, sort of have the people who take the samples have them take surveys and such, and then sort of use those surveys to get an idea of where the prototype is at the moment. And then from there, I would take that feedback and sort of incorporate it in the future.
Yeah, this one's a great example because I think it emphasizes the importance of user testing, which we'll get into at a later lecture, and I think will be a very important part of getting your prototypes right in the end of the class. So user testing is really having this systematic way of assessing how the users are interacting with your product. So I think a lot of what we talked about with Concierge, there was definitely some metrics in what we had talked about, but we also talked a lot about the more qualitative of, you know, having an interaction with them, having a relationship with them so that they can help make your product even better. But, you know, Julie, I like what you mentioned of almost like a scientific method of having different small batch versions of it, taking it to grocery stores, getting a randomized sample and figuring out who likes which version the best to help that drive your product development. And that's really critical, I think, is not only just getting your product out to customers so that they can help you create a better product, but also figuring out, do I have a structure that I can build around this so that I understand how my customers are interacting with my product, what aspects of my product do they like the most, and how can that dictate my product development further down the line. So I think that is a great example in the use of a methodology, right? You're not just saying, hey, I've got this soda that it's Coke, right? Or this is like the new greatest thing for people to drink. Instead, it's saying, I have a method of how to create the best tasting sodas. And I think that's something that is inherently more investable than even a product itself is. Do you have a platform that can churn out good products? And so Lynn, I see you asked in the chat, what's the difference between an MVP and a prototype? Hold that thought. We'll talk a little bit about that in the next slides, but there's not too much of a difference. Okay, so minimum viable product. One of the most common metaphors used for what is a minimum viable product is that it's a skateboard. It's not just a wheel, or it's not just a piece of your product, right? So you want to figure out, if you're trying to build like this great car, you want to figure out, well, what are you trying to accomplish? What is that minimum goal? And in this example, in this slide, your minimum goal is getting someone from point A to point B. And so if you want to get them from point A to point B, just having a wheel, even if it's like a really well-designed wheel, really would make people amazed. But your goal is to get them from point A to point B, that's not going to do it. Instead, you want to build something like a skateboard, which is something that will actually accomplish that goal. And then that might grow from a skateboard into a scooter, into a bike, into a motorized bike, and then into that car, right? So think about, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? Or what is the opportunity that you want to start to enable for the user functionally? And then that will help you get that minimum viable product out there. So you can't just have a really well-developed piece of a whole that doesn't get the job done. Instead, what you want is a very rudimentary whole that actually accomplishes the job that you're going after. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions about sort of that concept of the skateboard versus just a wheel or just a piece of a solution? I think one reason why this is emphasized is I think a lot of the times when we do team projects or assignments for school in general, there's an emphasis on having that final draft, something that looks really nice and shiny, even if it's not actually useful to anyone, right? With minimum viable product, what you're thinking is, what is the minimum product that actually will be useful to my customer? So always keep that in mind as you're building out your projects in this class. Is this actually going to accomplish a function that will be useful to my customer? Another thing, we talked a little bit about overdeveloping, and a similar phrase might be premature optimization. And one of the most common maxims in web development is that premature optimization is the root of all evil. And so this is something that I really want you to keep in mind, because you will be tempted. I am, to this day, always tempted to prematurely optimize, because if you're curious, if you're talented, you want to continue to perfect something. But what this is saying is, hold it and try to, figure out first, what does the customer really want? So the example here is this comic where the customer, will say, is asking for salt. And they're just waiting. And they say, hey, I said I would like some salt. No, I know. I'm developing a system that will pass you whatever condiment you want automatically, right? Meanwhile, your customer is angry. So this kind of goes back to the car versus the skateboard, right? If your customer wants some sort of mode of transportation and you're working on building the car from scratch, your customer will not be happy, because they're going to wait way too long to get this car. Whereas if you just give them some of these rudimentary modes of transportation, at least they'll get to point B, from point A to point B. And then you might be able to keep that customer on the ride as you start to develop better and better versions of this mode of transportation. So another way to say this in more technical jargon is, don't over design at low fidelity steps. And by low fidelity steps, I mean those early steps where you're just trying to get the basics down of what your product is. So another way to look at fidelity is this pyramid that I put out, which is the stages of web design. Number one is at the bottom, which is your sketch. And this is really just a back of the napkin idea, the lowest possible fidelity of how can I visually communicate what my idea is, what my product might be, in the most simple way possible. Amazon was actually a sketch at the very beginning. And I'll show you that sketch in the next slide. Number two is going to be your wireframe. And then your wireframe is sort of like a map or a blueprint of the site. This is where Balsamiq and other similar tools come in. So you're not trying to come up with any fancy designs or anything. All you want to do is show in very basic levels, what does my site map look like? What is that screen going to be? How is it going to get me to that next step? And then eventually towards satisfying whatever my goals might be through this app. Next up will be Mockup. And this is a little bit more of, especially if you are going to have developers create something for you, you want to give them a little bit of a higher fidelity illustration of what this is supposed to look like. So it might not be a fully functional prototype, but it will at least show in sort of like a snapshot fashion. So it's like a photo rather than something you can interact with, what the website should look like, so that developers, when they actually build the website, it will look like how you want it to look. We're actually going to skip Mockup in our class. We're gonna have the wireframes. If you want to add some visuals to it, you can make it a little bit more like a mock-up, but we're gonna go straight from that wireframe to prototype, because what I wanna do is show you how to code function and then a little bit of design, but we don't need to worry about, you know, creating fancy designs through a mock-up in this class. And then finally, the prototype. So the prototype should really be something that is functional and that enables our users to interact with it. And the reason that enabling of the users to interact is so important is because that's how you will now open up your product to being co-developed with your users. And that's how you can start to create something really magical, and it starts to get its own, really its own path, independent of what you might have originally thought it might become. And most great companies are really nothing like what the founder envisioned, but they sort of gained feet of their own, and they rode the wave of user interest over to something really cool and powerful. So here's an example of a sketch. Like I said, Amazon started as a sketch. So in this case, it was sort of, and this is Jeff Bezos's flywheel, where what he's basically saying is that by having a lower cost structure and lower prices, we can enhance the customer experience, which brings more traffic to sellers, which in turn creates more selection for the customers, which also enhances the customer experience. And so we end up having this virtuous cycle that eventually leads to higher growth, enables us to lower costs even more. And then all of that sort of feeds the growth of this company. So this is where Amazon went from a company that wasn't profitable for probably the first 10, 15 years of its existence. In fact, I even remember probably 7 years ago, pundits in the industry saying that, you know, this was when Amazon was already a very well-known company, as many billions of dollars in value. Pundits would say, hey, you know what? I don't really trust this company because it doesn't make money. And I don't trust a company that doesn't make money. Well, look at them now, right? I think they just had to get this flywheel to go enough to the point where they really broke through and became extremely profitable and really difficult to compete with. So that's the sketch, right? It's what's that very basic idea of how you can take your technology or your product idea and make that something sustainable for the future. Okay. Wireframe. So this is creating a map of how your content will actually be structured. So in this case, you really want to communicate what is this web page going to look like, right? Or what is this mobile app going to look like? How would a user go from going to Amazon.com to actually ending up with purchasing a product? And so the wireframe is a good way to do that. And we'll go through this as I show you how balsamic works. But one of the nice things about a wireframe is you're on purpose making it low fidelity. So you notice in this example, there's no color, there's no fancy design or anything. And the reason that we're doing this is because we don't want to spend time on that stuff. All we want to do is show what are the basics of this website going to look like. They're going to make it usable for our customers. And then that's going to set the stage for actually building a functional prototype. Any questions about wireframe or sketch? Next up is Mockup. And the Mockup is really getting a little bit more high fidelity. So in this case, you're actually trying to show what that web page will look like. The only difference between a mock-up and an actual prototype is that a mock-up doesn't work. It looks nice, and it's something that you could take to a developer and they would know, okay, I know how to turn this into a prototype, but it doesn't do anything. It's sort of something you would make on Photoshop, PowerPoint. There's several mock-up tools out there as well. But like I said, we won't actually focus on this in the class, but it's sort of, once we've figured out all the wireframe outlines of our site, we now fill it in with colors and colors and designs and images. The mock-up might be something that you would take to an investor because they like shiny, pretty things in order to invest in something, because you want to get them excited about the dream or the vision of what you're trying to create. Okay, and then finally, a prototype would be something that users can actually test. So it's got to have working buttons, it's got to have some level of data manipulation, and then the finished product will actually be sort of a proposal, right? So you can propose, hey, I am going to fulfill this function through this prototype, and you can enable the users to actually see how that would work. And this more or less is what you all will come up with at the end of this class. So again, lo-fi to hi-fi. There really isn't much of a difference between an MVP and a prototype. But what I will say is that a prototype is a little bit more defined than an MVP. So an MVP can be a prototype, and in our case, it will be a prototype. But an MVP could also be a mock-up. It could also be a wireframe. It sort of depends on what these standards are of whatever industry, whatever the competitive environment is that you're trying to get into. You know, as we mentioned, an MVP could be a video, and a video is definitely not at the level of a prototype. So an MVP is the minimum that you need to get customers excited, to get them to start interacting with you so that you can build the next versions, the next best versions of it. Whereas a prototype is a little bit more confined, where it needs to be usable, it needs to actually work. Does that answer your question, Lynn?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I have a random idea generator that I wanted to share with you all. And this is something that I created for the class. Here, I'll just copy the link and then paste it in the chat. But you know, in some ways, the random idea generator is also an MVP, because it's super simple, but it gets a point across. Now, for some reason, it does not work on Chrome. So I am going to stop my sharing, and then I will show you on Safari.
It's working on my Chrome.
Okay, for some reason it doesn't work on my Chrome. I don't know why. I had the same problem last year, and it was not a problem for others. So at least that part's good to know. So I'll show you. Can you see it on my screen now? So YouTube for cancer, blockchain for hospitals. The whole point here is that there is so much opportunity in digital health that I could just put a random internet buzzword and a random healthcare buzzword. And some of these are actually pretty good ideas. So virtual reality for caregivers, right? We could imagine how this could be super useful, because just getting to the place that you're going to be a caregiver for can be a huge inefficiency. So if you're able to address maybe a certain checkup or something in virtual reality, that could be huge. Same thing, YouTube for caregivers. So maybe as a training mechanism, a lot of caregivers are left to their own devices, but there might be a lot of common problems that they share. So if there was a YouTube that was geared specifically for caregivers, they could upload how-to videos and help each other out. Netflix for newborns, right? I think Netflix probably has something like this, right? Where it's imagine a lot of content that is just designed to get your newborn to fall asleep or calm down, right? So there's a lot out here. The reason that I created this is I just wanted to show how easy it is to come up with a new novel idea in digital health. You don't have to use these ideas for your particular idea, prototype, wireframe. But if you are stuck a little bit, I would encourage you to play around with it as a way to get unstuck. Okay. Any questions about sort of, well, let me go back to the slides before I ask questions. Okay. Okay, so back to the slides. Can you all see it? What I would like you to do is take our technology forms and give me an idea that you have. So this could be anything, right? There are no wrong answers here. It could be augmented reality for cancer. I don't care. And you could use the random idea generator, or you could just come up with something that's interesting for you. And what I'd like to do is use this as an opportunity to talk through a few of these ideas, just to inspire you all a little bit about how you can come up with this. Because I don't want you to get stuck at coming up with an idea. I want you to just roll with something, because there really are no bad ideas at this stage. And I think, once you have something that you like, we can start to talk about, okay, how do we make a wireframe for this? How could we then create a prototype for that wireframe? Tyler, I see you're raising your hand.
Yeah, do we want to try to stray away from anything that actually exists now?
No. I mean, I would like you to have maybe some spin on it if it's something that exists now, right? Like YouTube for newborns, right? I think YouTube obviously already exists, but the newborn aspect of it is sort of a unique spin where, if you call it like, Goo Goo Tube or something like that, then that could help you develop something that really could be unique and could get some traction within the marketplace. Does that answer your question? Anyone else have any questions around that? Okay, so let me share with you the link. Just one second. Sorry. For some reason I lost the link. Okay, here we go. All right, so I just sent the link. And then I also sent the link to that technology generator if you need a little bit of a jump start on ideas. So I'd encourage you to, maybe spend 3-4 minutes on coming up with an idea and then start to fill out that form, the storyboard form, and then we can talk through them.
Wait, is this our own idea or are we supposed to find a website, an existing product?
Yeah, great question. This is your own idea. So you're completely making this up.
The link takes me to the technology storyboard from last week.
Yeah, it is the same link. And that's a good point. So it's got the the website link question. So don't worry about that. You can just make up your URL. But the most important part is sort of the set the scene, who is this for, payers, providers, patients, etc. And then what are sort of the steps that the user would go through. And then of course, most importantly, the problem that it's solving. Okay, we have a good amount submitted. We can continue to submit if you're still working on it, but would anyone like to talk about their ideas? Might be a good way to hash out a little bit about your idea in preparation for building that wireframe out. Pablo, you're raising your hand. Would you like to go, Pablo? You're on mute.
Sorry, I was muted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So my idea was to use an app that a patient and a provider could both access. And the way that this would work is currently I feel like there's an issue where it's not easily accessible, your old medical records, your old medical tests, all the prescription you're on, every single doctor visit. If all of this was able to like upload to some kind of like a profile that you could use, right, and reference, and that could easily be switched when you go from like one insurance to another insurance or one doctor to another doctor, or even go abroad to like a different country to seek medical attention. If there was a way to transfer that information seamlessly, that way a different provider could see it and you can keep track record of everything, is kind of what I'm going for.
That's great. And so when I think about, what would be that minimum feature? Or I guess first, before I comment, what do you think that minimum feature might be?
I'm not entirely sure.
So I could think of two things, and sort of on other ends of the spectrum of the product. One could be the user experience. So how do we make that user interface as nice and easy to use as possible? Because I've used a few of those portal apps, chart apps, whatnot, and they're all lacking in some way, shape, or form. So thinking about how can I make this really nice from a user experience perspective. The other, sort of on the other end, if you want to focus on the portability of the data, would be, what does that interface look like that enables me to take my records from City of Hope and get them transferred over very quickly to Cedars-Sinai, right? So focusing in on that transfer part and how to make that as seamless as possible. Something like this, there's also a lot of regulatory hurdles, but In a class like this, don't worry about that. Just imagine that you've got a magic wand that can immediately wipe away all of those regulatory hurdles. I want you to just focus on what that user experience would look like. Cool. Would anyone else like to share their idea? Kevin?
Yeah, I had Yelp for cancer, so I was thinking of allowing a website that allows cancer patients to rate physicians, hospitals, and cancer treatment centers. So sort of like how we currently use Yelp for picking a restaurant, we can see other patrons' reviews and from there decide where to go. But for cancer patients, you would have the patients evaluate, and then any prospective cancer patient or somebody looking to switch their treatment, can go on there and look at different reviews and decide from there.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think that's definitely something that could work, especially if, these are Yelp reviews from cancer patients, which is already a very tight-knit community when we talk about cancer survivors. They want to help each other out. So I could definitely see that being useful. And, one thing you might want to focus on is, of course, you have Yelp as a backbone of what this should look like, or you could go in a completely different direction. But if you chose that as your backbone, you could think about, okay, well, what's different about this, right? Well, what are the different categories, rating styles, questions that you might need to have when talking about a cancer journey versus a restaurant, right? So thinking about what are those differentiators going to be, I think will be a fun exercise as you're going through the wireframe. Did you have any initial thoughts of what might be different?
Yeah, I was thinking for sure putting what type of cancer you have and the type of treatment, because that's very specific. And then also different metrics for evaluating the physician that you're seeing and the different types of treatment centers, because they offer different state-of-the-art treatments. So you want to be able to filter through that. Like, let's say you have stage 4, then a stage 1 chemotherapy patient's review won't be really that useful for you. So yeah, things like that.
Okay, great. Hassan.
Yeah, I had a Netflix for drug discovery. And so my idea was that it's like a similar Netflix structure where there's a bunch of panels and a bunch of different genres, but the panel would instead be like the name of the drug and the genres would be the indications. And so when you click on that certain panel, you would get things like episodes, or in this case, it could just be like subcategories where you could be provided things like, and this is for like novel therapeutics, things that are in like clinical trials or in early development. It would be things like their trial success rates, relevant journal articles and things like that, anything to do with funding, and then development updates as well. I think one drawback is that when you have that, there could be way too many for like a certain indication, and you don't want any that have made it to the market and things like that. So you could actually maybe then come up with a filter to get rid of that issue. But yeah, I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And so what do you imagine the content being? Do you imagine it being sort of mixed media, all kinds of content? You mentioned papers and all that, or will there be a focus on more video type of content?
Oh yeah, I'd say like maybe it would be focused more on like the scientific material, but there could be like a debrief video that's maybe like 1 to 2 minutes long that kind of summarizes that. So it's like maybe this novel therapeutic, it's currently in stage 1 trials, has backing by this company and has shown success with this particular indication at this percentage of a response rate and things like that.
Yeah, and I could imagine that being kind of useful. I think more and more people like to passively consume media, right? And people still read, but people love podcasts and things that talk to them while they're getting the groceries or going on a run or something like that. So I could see something like that being a helpful way to get your download of information if you're working in drug discovery. And so thinking about what would be the seamless way to do that could definitely be helpful. And you know, you could imagine, let's say you're looking for, like you mentioned, those videos or little snippets of someone summarizing status. Eventually you probably want other people to create that for you, but at the start you could do the Wizard of Oz strategy and you know, maybe you're doing it all yourself, right? And probably working long hours, but you're creating something that's useful for people so that you can get a loyal customer base.
Yeah, absolutely. And then one other idea that popped into mind was, you know how you get recommended movies and things like that based off of what you watched before. There could be a similar thing like that based off of, you know, the type of indications that you're looking at, or you could maybe have an option that you select if you're a provider or a certain researcher that wants to focus on particular indications, then maybe only those will start to show up and things like that. But yeah.
Absolutely. And so Mary's asking if this would be for cancer patients who belong to the scientific community or more general public.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I just selected it from the generator. I didn't get that far.
I just brought it up because it reminded me of focusing early on your targeted end user. If it's for the general population, journal articles aren't written for general population. So you might think instead, oh, I'm targeting more cancer patients, then I might use popular news articles and then maybe give the link for more information to journals. Or you want, I think it'd be really fantastic if you created it for the scientific community, because oftentimes, I mean, we have all this extra knowledge, so we're more likely to freak out because we know too much. So I just think that by suggesting journals, you open up a very interesting underserviced population. So thank you.
Yeah. And
I
think there's also a service, as you were talking about that, Mary, for kind of translating scientific articles into the vernacular or into the layman's terms. So you can provide maybe a blog post summary that talks about the major points of the scientific articles so that they're now accessible to patients. Or maybe it could be a podcast discussion or something that's on video that they can get download without being confused by all the jargon that you find in scientific papers. It was actually Johns Hopkins. I think they stopped doing this, but they had an organization that curated a lot of the articles around COVID. So that was actually a resource that I really liked. I didn't really like getting my COVID news from the major media sources. I liked getting just sort of a summarized version of the papers that were coming out. And it would actually include takes as well from these Johns Hopkins scientists of were the methods strong, what were the strengths and weaknesses of a given paper. So
I see. That's a really good idea, I think, for disseminating the info to patients. But I think the original idea was actually for drug discovery. So it'd be focused on producers instead.
Great.
Yeah.
I like it. Okay, anyone else would like to talk about their idea? Leilani?
Yeah, hello. Sorry. So one of the ideas I thought of was like an app for women that suffer with PCOS, which is like irregular like periods or like with reproductive health as well, like hormone issues. And like a lot of like women don't know what it is. And so it can be like an app that provides like information on like diets as well, like what type of like, but mostly like diet, like what kind of food is good for your like in order to like regulate your period again, as well. Like it can help women, like I know it one of the problems with PCOS is it can be difficult to get like pregnant. So it can also like help out with that, giving information and as well like tracking your period so you're not like lost in where it is. But I that was an idea that I thought of because I feel like it's not a lot of people aren't really like aware of it. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that could be tremendously valuable. And I think you'd have a pretty clear user segment, right? That you can go after, and when you do your user testings, get a sense for, well, what are the problems that you are having, right? With tracking your period or issues with your period. And getting some of that information can help you with iterating features on top of what you've already got, which is already a strong concept. And then it's just figuring out, okay, well, what are the most desirable things to track? And then to what end, right? How is this going to help outcomes in a certain way? Great. Okay. Let's see. Anyone else?
I just want to point out that decision making and decision support for newborns is an idea that came up. I'm pretty sure that's called a parent.
Yeah, exactly. But so here's where, so when we say decision support, sort of thinking, are there apps that can help me make those decisions? And so let's imagine child is crying. Child's been crying for 2 hours. Child is fed. Child should not be sleepy, right? Maybe he or she just woke up. What the heck am I supposed to do, right? And maybe the app can ask those questions, right? And say, yes, fed, yes, sleepy. And say, well, have you changed the diaper? Oh no, I didn't change the diaper because I'm so exhausted and I forgot to do that. And then it turns out that they have wet diapers. So I have a newborn right now. I have a 9-month-old. And I can tell you that there's a checklist of like 5 or 6 things that are the answer to a crying child almost every time. But sometimes we forget one of them. And if we had just remembered up front, we would have saved a lot of drama, so to speak. So, you know, I'd use that. If there was an app where I could just be reminded of my mental checklist.
So kind of like having a virtual doula.
A virtual what?
Doula?
What's that? I've never heard
A
of.
doula is a very specific subset of a parenting aid. Some of them start while you're pregnant and help you get ready for the baby. And then there's another subset of doulas who stay with you and kind of ease you into the transition of being a new parent.
Sure.
And this is kind of like a virtual doula.
Mm-hmm.
That's so cool.
I think that's a great comparison, right? And I see Asan just said notepad on the fridge, and that definitely works too. And each serves different purposes, right? The advantage of the notepad on the fridge is that it's there. I just have to glance at it. You know, sometimes the low-tech solutions are actually fine, right? And you know, I might be more likely to glance over the fridge than to pull my phone out of my pocket and try to log into an app. However, you can imagine an app that grows with the child, right? Like as you were mentioning, Mary, of how there's different phases where you might need different types of help. And so maybe it knows, oh, hey, you know, your child is 6 months old, and this is usually when they become very colicky. So it might be that. And you might want to check, you know, what you're feeding your child, because maybe that has something to do with it.
You could also add audio, have it say, be an app that pairs with Google. Hey, Google, why is my baby crying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or maybe, hey, Google, listen to this. And then maybe it learns, you know, this might be a little creepy, but maybe machine learning understands, okay, like this cry for your child means that, you know, he's hungry, right?
I just see you like lifting up your baby. Hey, Google.
Right? Google handle this, right? And then, you know, maybe Google says, hey, you know what? When your child was crying like this last week, it was food. So maybe try the same thing, right? So you can imagine something like this actually working for some people, right? Again, there's going to be some people who are going to say, this is ridiculous. But as long as there's a percentage, even a small percentage of the market that is really interested in it, then you've got enough to go on. And you can grab that market, and then eventually you might grow into something huge, right? When Facebook came out, no one cared about, you know, tracking profiles of people that they knew. It just wasn't a thing. But they found that it was actually useful for like college students And then that grew into something where now all of our parents are on it and even grandparents. And so now it's no longer cool for college students, right? So there's a whole progression for how these startups can go from very fringe ideas to something that everyone's using. Anyone else? After this, we'll go on a bit of a break, but I'd like to give some of you who haven't participated a chance, because it'll be, I think, a little bit less easy to participate in the wireframe part. Well, there's still potential. But I saw some good ideas from people who haven't talked yet. Would anyone like to share theirs? All right, well, let's take our break then, and we'll be back at 4:17. I am going to actually share my, well, hold on, before I share my screen, I want to give you all a link to Balsamic. Okay, I'm going to put this in the chat. Some of you may have already done this, but this is a link to installing Balsamic. So just so that you have it in preparation for later in the lecture. You know, it's your break, so you don't have to do it during your break, but just wanted you to have it. Okay. And I'll stick around during the break so that you all can ask me any questions that you have, particularly around Balsamic and getting that installed on your Google Drive. All right, so come back at 4:17 or 4:18.
I have a coding question.
Sure.
I'm trying to Google how to add a video chat into a website, and it's a lot to filter through. So I was wondering if you had a guide, like a keyword or something.
Yeah, that video chat will probably be either tricky or not. It depends on, I think, if any of the video chat companies already have something. So I would Google maybe video chat embed.
I've been doing that. And there's a lot of like different ones that come up. I'll just keep looking.
Gotcha. And then, you know, what you're looking for is probably something that doesn't require any backend code. It would only require HTML and maybe JavaScript to get everything working. And then, you know, a lot of it can be trial and error. It's just try a few of them, see if they work.
I saw some things on HTML with the tailored I think it's CSS or something like that. It's in it's after the HTML. We go into that.
Yes.
Where you're making a specific script to run in your HTML, and you're calling it in, calling the function.
That would probably be JavaScript.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. So with that, you're sort of dependent on, you know, another company like YouTube does it for streaming video. I'm not sure exactly what company you go with for the video chat, but I'm sure there's something. That the thing is, they might make you pay for that. That seems to me like a service that someone would charge for. But you know, if it's something where it just sort of, if you're not paying for it, it goes to a login, then that could work as well.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, let's get started. So can you all see the slides? Am I sharing that again? Great. So the next concept that I want to cover is the concept of user stories. And a user story it's kind of another way of defining a problem that the user faces or an opportunity that they want to take advantage of that you are trying to solve for with your solution. So the general structure of a user story is as a blank. So in that first blank, we're talking about who that user is. So this is the who question. As a cancer patient, as an example, I want to do what? So here's my what question. So as a cancer patient, let's take the Yelp for cancer patients example. I want to see the quality of my potential providers so that I can, and here's sort of the why, so that I can have a better treatment experience or better health outcomes. Could be anything, right? And how we fill in those blanks will determine really what we're prioritizing through our product development. So as a who, I want to do what so that I can why. Does that make sense? So sort of the who, the what, and the why of a given feature. Now, for our wireframes, we're going to create multiple user stories, right? They might not all be of equal importance, but we want to have different user stories for each different feature that we're going to build in our wireframe. Any questions about this? This is an important concept to be able to grasp. You know what my my room or my view went away, so I can't actually see who's raising their hand. Anyone raising their hand? Okay. So another example that I have here, as a diabetes physician, I want to be able to see my patient's Fitbit steps so that I can coach them in real time. So that might be another example of a user story. Another example, and this is something that I had created about 1.5 years ago as part of my company, WeHealth, is we realized that in LA County, at least, the process of finding a vaccine site or a testing site was very difficult. You had to go through their webpage and you had to answer a bunch of questions. And then if you answered it correctly, so to speak, they would then connect you with different vendors. You then had to answer the questions again. It was a whole mess. And so we created a scraper that basically got all of that information into one place so that a given patient could see this information immediately. So the user story that we created around that before we built it was, as a patient, I want to be able to see vaccine sites near me so that I can get vaccinated quickly and easily. So as a patient, that told us, okay, we're not focusing on vendors or anything. We're just focusing on the patient experience. In the case of COVID, actually, a patient is really everyone, right? So as a normal user, I want to be able to see vaccine sites near me. So another thing that we focused in on in doing our user research is that location was really important. People didn't want to do all this searching only to say, hey, you got to go to Dodger Stadium no matter what, even if you're 30 miles away. Okay, cool. I got my screen back when someone joined. They wanted to see what's actually walkable or what's within a couple miles from me. And so what we did is we made everything location based. So if someone put in their zip code, they could see very quickly what's around there. And in fact, because we saw that that was so important, when we built the zip code search, we made it something where they didn't even have to click submit. As they started typing the zip code, it would filter based on what they were putting into their zip. So if I did, 90210, it would give me a bunch of locations. Then if I said, you know what, how about 90211? I just had to backspace the O, add a 1, and then a different set of locations would show up. So we wanted to really prioritize that because that's what we learned from our user feedback. And then so that they can get vaccinated quickly and easily. So we had to focus on user experience and speed because of what we learned in talking to our users. So that's another user story. For this particular feature, we determined a list of functions that it would take to fulfill this user story. So here we decided, okay, well, we needed to categorize the vaccine sites by location. We also needed to have a quick pop-out link for each site that would enable them to register right away. And we didn't make them register through our site because we knew that they were going to have to register no matter what if they're going to sign up through Healthvana or Rite Aid or whomever. So we want to just make that, go ahead, go there, get your registration done where you need to do it, and don't have to put in redundant information. So from the user story, we came up with a list of features that would help satisfy that user story. And then we assigned a level of difficulty based on that. And so that helps us prioritize. So another user story is we found that not only did we need to build something for the users, but a lot of community leaders started reaching out to us. And what they were telling us is they wanted to be able to very quickly and easily communicate with their whole communities so that they'd be aware when new opportunities popped up. So one group that we worked with was the Pacific Islander COVID response team. And because Pacific Islanders were actually, at least at the beginning stages, under vaccinated and under treated within LA County, these community organizers were very concerned. And so they said, hey, we will get told on a given day, this vaccine site is now opened up for anyone in your community. Please, tell them to go ahead and grab it. But by the end of the day, all the slots would be taken. So they said, when I get this information, I need to disseminate that knowledge to my community as quickly as possible. So in order to satisfy that user story, we realized that we needed an ability to enable these community members or these leaders to message their community members very quickly. So we created a way for them to input a bunch of phone numbers into the platform, and then with one click of a button, they could text all of these people immediately, right? Because what they're finding is that they were just emailing a list, people weren't getting to the emails in time and all that. So we created a way for them to text them right away. And we also built a Twitter bot that would scrape the internet as new opportunities would come up, and then it would notify the community leaders. So this was a little bit more difficult, but we came up with these features as a result of this user story that we created. And we created the user story as a result of our communication with our user base. Does that make sense how sort of the user story can flow into a list of features? Another user story is we actually found that there were a lot of these volunteers. They call themselves Vaxliteers, I think, Vaxliteers. And essentially what they were doing is they were scouring the internet at any given time, and they would look for slots that would open up. And so as a volunteer, what we learned from them, they wanted to be able to communicate all of their tips with their colleagues so they can efficiently guide others. So in order to help them with this, we built a two-way communication between volunteers, as well as the ability for any of those volunteers to suggest and then verify, curate any tips that they get. So this is a little bit more difficult for us because we had to build a two-way communication flow. But again, is a user story that we heard from really being close with the users of our platform. And then we came up with features in order to satisfy that user story. So this is something that I want you all to focus on as you're building your wireframes, is creating different user stories that help communicate the problem that you're trying to solve or the opportunity that you're trying to help your users take advantage of, and build your functions around those user stories. Okay, so next activity, I would like you to create some user stories. So just use this format. I actually don't have a Google form for this one, so you can go ahead and just write it down. But think about this in the context of your ideas and write a user story that encapsulates one aspect of the problem that you're trying to solve or opportunity that you want to be able to enable your users to take advantage of. I'll give you maybe 5 minutes for this one, maybe a little less, like 2 or 3 minutes. All right, would anyone like to share a user story? Mary?
So a little background, my idea is inspired by COVID, and I want to focus on the mental health strain for people in quarantine. So I wrote 3. As a patient, I want to connect with other patients so I can feel less isolated. As a therapist, I want to provide mental health resources more accessibly so I can help patients remotely. As a quarantined patient, I would like to feel connected to the outside world so I can feel a part of society.
Great, I like those. And so the next step will be to figure out features that you'll build, and you'll build this into your wireframe that will help satisfy those user stories. Can you think of maybe one feature for one of the user stories right now?
Yeah, it's links to the question that I asked right before break. To connect people to the outside world, I feel that it's extremely important to give a face-to-face contact. So I would like the option of having patients, or not even patients, just users, be able to sign up for a time slot to have a video conference call right through an app.
Great, yeah. I like it. Anyone else? All right, got a couple of volunteers. Alexa.
I guess from the last class, we were talking about sort of a virtual reality for surgery type of tool. And I was thinking that if you're just a medical student, you probably just want to memorize the anatomy, the procedures, what tools to use so that you can get your certification, pass your exams. And then as a actual surgical tool developer, you sort of want to test how does your surgical tool compare to what's already out there. And so maybe having some sort of like sensors that you can apply to the devices and then see how that's being like held, how it's being maneuvered by surgeons in comparison to the previous devices that are being used.
Yeah, that's
And
interesting.
then, yeah.
And that's a unique take, right? Where we're talking about the developers themselves. And also might be probably the most lucrative part of that business model. So if we can provide something that's useful to them, then they could fund some of the features that you might use for the medical student side who don't have that sort of money to fund your operation. So it can be sort of a virtuous cycle in that way. Now, but before you move on, I know you had another thing. There's also this so that I can why. So what would be go into a little bit more of the why we're putting the sensors on for these developers?
For the surgical tool developers, I guess just making better, like more maybe ergonomic surgical tools, some that are like smaller, easier to maneuver, just would help them to be able to sell them more. So it's sort of like staying ahead of competition, really getting that innovation, optimizing their process as well. So I think that's sort of more of where it goes for them.
Great. Yeah. And I think thinking about that why, you mentioned the ergonomic reasons, and there also might be, just general usability, satisfaction, and all that. Thinking about what are the most important factors will help you understand, well, what sensors do you need to put in? Maybe what is the interface need to look like so that you can get an understanding of how those factors are playing out with a given device.
And then for the last thing, it's just on the patient side to be able to see what's happening in the procedures. And maybe even beyond that, like have reminders of how do you, like what do you need to do for the recovery process and stuff like that would be more geared towards the patient.
Yeah. And so going back to that, I liked it too, because that's sort of the other end, right, of your product potential stakeholders, right, is the patient side. So to be able to view their procedures, and then the so that I can why. So why would they want to view the procedures? And thinking about that could help you think about, okay, well, how can I make that more effective for them?
I think for this case, probably just being more comfortable with going to the operating room and maybe also helping their family be more comfortable. Then that's another thing is like, it's very daunting. So it becomes more of like, not just you, but those around you as well can be very concerned.
Yeah, and I like that you mentioned that because I think that will help guide the development of the product in that way. Because if it's just to see the procedure, I got the LASIK laser eye surgery like 10 years ago. And I watched the video of that. That did not comfort me at all. Seeing how they peeled my eye open and all of that, no good, right? But if we know that the reason we want to do this is for comfort, we can focus on material that will actually bring that comfort. So rather than just blindly sharing videos of the surgery, we could share maybe how easy the prep is or how quickly the recovery goes, things like that, to help them feel like they know what they're getting into. Maybe the surgery itself will be blackout and then wake up, but then while I'm conscious, what do I know that I need to prepare for so that I can walk into this surgery confident and knowing what's going to happen? Maybe also setting expectations. My father got back surgery and it was the worst decision that he ever made for about 3 months, and then suddenly became the best decision he ever made after 3 months. It just took that long for things to align, right? And that seems to be pretty common with a lot of back surgeries. So
you.
expectation setting could definitely be something too. Tyler, I see your hands up.
I was thinking along the lines of something that both healthcare insurances and providers can use. It's more of like an administrative idea, but as a provider, I want to make pre-authorizations easier so that I don't have to waste time and effort in my office, because I know that's a large part of the administrative work in providers' offices. So maybe I was thinking that there could be a platform where doctors' offices and healthcare insurances can opt into, so that those pre-authorizations can be a lot easier and less time consuming. So a direct line of communication between those two.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's sort of a very to the point and simple one, right? It's like we want to reduce redundancies, make something a little bit more efficient. And so because we know now why, because they're very busy, there's a lot going on, and we just want to cut out double work, we can really use that as our guiding star as we build these features. And so the reason I wanted to go through a few, and I think, you know, everyone who shared, these were some great examples, is because you can see how these user stories can guide your features. You know, if what I'm saying is, I want to build something that allows patients to chat with each other, but I don't know why, right? Because I haven't done that user story part, then I might spend hours, days, weeks, months trying to build some feature. But if I didn't really center it around this user story of the who, the what, the why, I don't know who I'm building it for, I don't know what they're trying to do, and I don't know why they're trying to do it, then I could be misled in my product development. So that's why I really, especially in this class, I take these user stories very seriously, because this is what's going to help make sure that the prototype that you build is the right prototype. Right? We talk about these MVPs being simple and all that, but that V part, the viable part, is very important here, right? We want to make sure that we're building something that really is going to work to help solve a problem for our end users. Any questions before we move on? This is sort of the end of that section. And then from here on out, we'll be talking about balsamic and wireframing. Mary, you have a question?
What's a good rule of thumb for how many potential solutions you have to fulfill to meet a user story?
As many as, well, the minimum number that are required to fulfill that user story. And you might pick the wrong one. That's fine. But
so one?
One if possible. Sometimes you need more than one feature to sort of get the job done, right? But if you're able to do it with one feature, you're able to say, you know what, with this feature, I've satisfied this user story, then that's all you do. And then you roll it out. It stinks because our MVPs usually stink. Our user tells us why, and then we figure out how to improve it, right? So it's sort of that speed to user that we're really focusing on, and trying to cut out any of the fat along the way, so that we're able to get them that minimum thing that'll work, and then they can tell us what's next.
So can an MVP have multiple steps to it, or is each step an MVP?
Yeah, an MVP can have multiple steps.
Cool.
That definitely. Yeah, I don't want, there should be no mental gymnastics in trying to get to that minimum. But it's more one of those things, it's like writing a tweet, right? It's, if let's say you write your tweet initially outside of Twitter and it's like 400 characters, right? And you can't fit it in the box. Then you figure out what's not essential and you cut it out, right? So you can edit after the fact to make sure you're cutting out the extraneous things. I wouldn't worry too much about that. But if you find yourself straying, just, you know, remind yourself, okay, let's keep this simple. Let's make sure we're doing the minimum that's required to satisfy this user story, because we just want to get it to the user, and then the user will tell us what comes next. Okay. Okay, balsamic. So this is the general outline of balsamic. It's very similar to PowerPoint, but it's tailor-made for web design. So you can see that for the most part, it's black and white. You can put color in if you want to, but it's a lot of the flashiness is removed from it on purpose. And you'll also end up noticing that a lot of it looks like it's hand drawn. And that's also on purpose. They're trying to really emphasize that this is low fidelity. You're just trying to show function. And in the context of this class, you're trying to show function in the context of satisfying these user stories that you come up with. But this is the basic format. And it automates a lot of the fundamental web page features, right? Like scroll bars, input fields, things like that, so that you don't have to worry about creating them yourself. You can see, just point out this example to the right, what something might look like in Balsamic and how that might be turned in to a cool looking mockup. So we have this Ivy Lily creative. You notice in the wireframe, they're not worried about design. They're not worried about images. They're just trying to show, you know what, I want this page. I want it to have certain tabs. I want to highlight featured work right here. I want people to be able to meet the artist of these works, maybe watch a video created by that artist, contact information. So it's the essential layout of the page that's needed to accomplish whatever they're trying to accomplish. And then that gets turned into something pretty, but we start with something basic. Any questions about that? Okay, so I don't think you all will need to do this first bullet because I just used your KGI emails. And as I understand, all of your KGI emails are associated with Google Drive. So you should be good on that sense. If you're having any problems though, let me know and we could use a different email. I just need to add your email into the who's a student that gets free Balsamic, because Balsamic is something you have to pay for. But you all, by virtue of being in this class, will be able to use it for free. Okay. And then install via the instructions that are in the chat. So it's this balsamic.com/wireframe/Google Drive docs installing installation. So if you haven't already, click that link. And then that link will take you to the sort of Google add-on section where you can add Balsamic to your Google Drive. Make sure you are in the right account, right? So you're in your KGI account when you do all this. I'll give you a couple minutes to do that. And then once you install Balsamic into your Google Drive, all you have to do is, as shown in the image on the right of this slide, act like you're creating a Google file, right? So as if you were going to create a new Google Doc, Google Sheet, Google Slides, but instead of choosing one of those, go to More, and then Balsamic wireframes should show up in your More slide, or your More drop down. If it doesn't, try reloading the page. If that doesn't work, try restarting the browser. But it should work. And if you have any problems with the installation, or if it's saying that you don't have a free account, just let me know. Send me your email. I'll make sure that it's aligned. I would like you to be able to follow along with Balsamic, but it's not essential. You can always just pay attention to what I'm doing and then get Balsamic to work after the fact. Okay, so in general, is this working for you all? Can I get any thumbs up if it's okay? I'm seeing some nods. So that's good. So let's move forward. If you're having any trouble, just chat me and we'll work through it. But don't worry too much if you can't get it set up for this lecture. So here is the basic balsamic page. So when you have it opened up, you'll see that you have this canvas, which is just like a PowerPoint canvas, except it's a little bit more infinite. So it can be as big or as little as you want. You're not choosing your slide size ahead of time. On the left are what are called frames. And I'm going to give you all the option to do this one of two ways. Some people like to put all of their wireframe on one canvas, on one frame, right? And that's perfectly legitimate, right? You could have a bunch of different screens with arrows that lead to the next screen, all on one slide, so to speak, and that works. Other people like to split it up so that each frame is maybe a different screen or a different feature. All of those are legitimate. So it's sort of how you would prefer to work, how you like to visualize these things. Keep in mind that you will be presenting these. You'll be limited to about 5 minutes because of the size of the class. So try to put it in a way that you would be comfortable sharing quickly with the rest of the class. Assets are on the top ribbon. And these are kind of built-in functions that enable you to not have to build them yourself. So if you're gonna, I know a lot of these ideas, they involve metrics. So if you're gonna have a bar chart or a line graph, and you want to visualize that, you don't have to actually create the bar chart or the line graph. All you have to do is grab one of these assets and then drag it onto your screen. And then voila, all of a sudden you have the appropriate metrics, or at least the visualization of those metrics. There's also a description. So here's where I'd like you to outline your basic user story, the basic premise of what you're trying to build, so that I can see that. And then a feature that I use extensively, and you'll see this during the demo, is Quick Add. So you can browse assets, of course, which I'd recommend that you do at first, just so that you can see what Balsamiq offers. But once you get used to it and you want an arrow, you can just type arrow into Quick Add, and then the arrow will show up and you can drag it into your presentation. You can also import assets. So definitely remember this more controls button on the upper right. This enables you to basically download packages that might be built for what you're trying to do. And this is more of a crowdsourcing marketplace community, whatever you want to call it. So if you're building like a Fitbit type of thing, there might be a package that is built strictly around Internet of Things. So it might be something worth looking up. I don't want you to spend too much time on getting fancy stuff through import assets, but it's definitely worth a browse. The reason I don't want you to spend too much time is because, remember, this is low fidelity. So really I'm looking for like buttons and fields and stuff. That's it. You can keep it simple, focus on the user story, you'll be successful. Here's some useful resources. I make these available in the assignment module within Canvas. So you don't have to worry about writing these down. You'll be able to access them. I also post a video of me doing sort of a how-to on Balsamiq from a previous course. I will also, as usual, post the video of this lecture, which at the end right now will include me going through Balsamiq as an example. Okay, so I am going to stop sharing for a brief moment. Any questions while I load up the next screen? We'll dive into balsamic for the remainder of the lecture. And I am open to any questions that you all have as I'm demonstrating too. So please feel free to interrupt. This is your opportunity to, if you're wondering how the heck do I do XYZ with my wireframe, to get me to do it in front of you, then you can just copy what I do. So definitely encourage participation in this section. All right, where is it? Great. Can you all see my screen? Okay, so the first thing I'll do, we talked a little bit about this vaccine finder that we built as part of WeHealth. I'll show you what a wireframe for that might look like. And I'll try to do it quickly. So you notice there's Android, iOS. This is really just a preference. They all kind of look the same. But since I have an iPhone, I'll just use the iPhone one. And I dragged that over, and now all of a sudden I've got an iPhone. Notice this button right here, this eye. This is super neat. It enables me to basically dictate different features of this. So if I want a bigger iPhone, I could make this bigger, or actually I would like this to be a little bit smaller. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this down to 400 and then make my height, let's call it 750, right? So now it's just a little bit smaller on my screen, a little bit easier to work with on my small screen. If I wanted to, I could also flip it on its side. That's kind of weird. So I don't really want that, but I could also change the model of the iPhone. So really neat way to change what my sort of container looks like, right? Okay, now let me first go back to my user stories. So as a patient, I want to be able to see vaccine sites near me so I can get vaccinated quickly and easily. So I'm going to actually put this. You could either put it in your wireframe notes. So I'll put it there. But just as another example, if I wanted to, I'm going to quick add text. And I'm also going to put it here. Now, before I do that, notice that when I added this quick add text, it added a lot of weird stuff. The reason it wanted to give me like a bold one and a red one is it wanted to show me how I can format my text. So if I edit this, you can see, oh, okay, if I put asterisks around something, it's going to be bold. If I put this like color red brackets around something, it'll be red. So let's try that out. As a patient, I want to be able to see vaccine sites near me. Why don't I also try making my as a patient color red. Actually forgot what that's supposed to look like. So let me undo. So color red and then end that with color. Look at that, turned red. And then maybe I want to bold the next one. So I want to be able to see vaccine sites near me. And then how about the final line? I want to make blue. So instead of color red, we'll say color blue.
So it's like LaTeX then?
Say that again?
So it's like LaTeX then? LaTeX?
I actually don't really know LaTeX, but are we talking about just the formatting?
Like the formatting the text.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sort of, yeah, I guess what I've had to do in some like forums and stuff. Yeah, so it's pretty basic. And if I forgot how to do something, I could just add the text again, right? So I could drag this block of text. And you can see that it's got, their own ways of doing it too. So don't worry too much about this stuff, but I just want to show you there are ways to format, what you're trying to do. So let's add a title. So I type title in the quick add, a big title. Let's rename this to vaccine sites. Now, remember that we said, I want to be able to see vaccine sites near me, right? Uh-oh. Okay, I'm back. And I mentioned in the lecture that one thing that we wanted to do to be able to see that easy is enable them to enter their zip code. So I dragged this search box, which showed up in this text column, but I could also find it by just searching for search, right? This would also enable me to do a search box from Android if I preferred that. Let's say I do prefer that because I kind of like that it's got this little microphone. So that demonstrates that, you know what, like we can search, but I could also just use the microphone feature of my phone to enable them to just say where they are, right? Now I'm going to change search to what is your zip code? Just to be a little bit more clear for my potential users. Just to remind you, because I have this I clicked, right? And then I just unclicked it, but now I'm going to click it again. Oops. If I click the I and I highlight my search bar, I now have different things that I can change about it, right? So if I don't like that it's a square, instead I want it to be a circle, I can click the rounded corners thing. If I want to have it linked to something, I could have it linked to maybe a different frame, something like that. It might be more useful for a button than a search field, but something I can do. Icons, right? I can turn the mic on or off, depending on if I want that to show up. Same with the magnifying glass. State, we have this normal, focused, disabled. Focused means it's sort of being highlighted, right? So it's blue. Disabled means it's grayed out. Why don't we call this one focused? I can also change the text. So I can underline it, italicize it, make it bigger. Why don't we just bold it? Okay. I got my zip code. Next, I need some sort of table or data grid. Looks like here I've got a data grid. Let's see what this looks like. Okay, cool. It's like a table, right? So it's kind of ugly to edit, but I can edit it. So you can see that each line is sort of a different row. Each comma is separating the column. Okay, so let's change this to site name. What is that R thing? Looks like the R is sort of a new line. Let's just get rid of that. We don't need it. The looks like this caret. If I put a space between the caret and the name, it gives me this little sort thing. right? So that can be kind of cool to show that my sites can be sorted. If I have the up caret and the down caret, it gives me the up and down sort. So why don't I just do the up and down sort for both? Call the next column location. And then maybe the next one is link. Or how about slots? And then the final column will be link. And I'm probably not going to be sorting by links, so I'll take away that sort. Okay, so what do I have? I've got a site name that's sortable, a location that's sortable, whether or not slots are open, and then a link. So you notice actually that the link has sort of these symbols, which is kind of what I want for the slots open. So what I'm going to do here is look for which one I want. Do I want the radio button or do I want the check mark? I think I want the check mark. So it looks like the check mark is for Marco Botten. So it's this. Looks like this is a check mark. So just to make things simple, I'm actually going to change my headers. I'm going to delete link and then put it before slots open, because I know that slots open is where I want my checkboxes. I'm going to actually change this radio button into a checkbox. And then we'll do maybe a blank one here, and then we'll leave that one blank. So essentially I've got either checks or non-checks based on whether or not the slots are open. Does that make sense? Okay, I can just change the site names. Let's call it Stadium. Cedars Sinai. Hope. Then why don't we call the last one KGI? And you can actually see this data grid docs. I kind of like this, right? It's giving me a link and a little pop-out symbol. So I kind of want to steal that and put it in this column. So I'm going to just copy that. And I'm going to delete this row altogether. But I'm going to steal that link and put it in my third column. So column 1, comma, column 2, comma, column 3. And let's put it here, here, here. Okay, so I messed up with the second row. All I got to do to fix that is find the second row. So it's the Cedar Sinai one. Realize that I just need an extra column, comma. Seemed like that was missing. And then that moved it over here, right? So that's sort of the gist of it, right? So I know I've got site names, locations, links, slots open. I don't want to spend too much time sort of beautifying this, but you can get the idea, right? I want to have a way to search for a zip code, and then that will filter my table that shows links, whether or not slots are open, etc. Mary, I see you've got a question.
Yeah. Can you take a feature and copy out the code like you are and paste it into like another feature? So say like you have on the top, you have menu bar, and say you want to add the caret. Can you use the table that you have, copy that out and put it into the menu bar? So you have maybe one that has a drop down.
Yeah, so I could just copy this and then paste it like I would copy and paste anything else. So I could use Command C to copy and then Command V to paste.
Oh, no, I'm not talking about like duplicating a feature
Okay.
and then editing that. I'm talking about like when you edit the feature, it gives you the starter code for certain
Sure.
details, like the carrots.
Mm-hmm.
Can you copy that detail that generates the arrow and put it, say, in a menu bar that doesn't have the carrot? Say you have a menu bar like contact, and then you have maybe location and you want the drop down to be in like a menu. Can you put the carrot in there?
Let's find out. So I got a menu bar here. Okay. And I don't think I want this like file edit view help thing, but let's call it home, about us, vaccine info, connect with others, something like that, right? Looks like connect with others. It's too long, so let's just change that to connect. Now, what happens if I put a carrot next to about us? So it didn't work with the menu. So it's all sort of specific to the given feature that you're using. So the only way I could really recommend going about it is trial and error. So try to see if it'll work with a given menu or something like that. And if it doesn't, it's honestly not a big deal because I can sort of tell what you're trying to do with this anyway. You know what I mean? So, remembering that
So
a
then
wireframe is not about looking perfect, but it's about getting the point across. And
so is that where you would use the arrow you're talking about? So arrow and then maybe illustrating a drop down menu?
exactly. Yeah. So what I might do, because if I'm worried that you might not get the point with about us, what I would do is I would put an arrow. Delete that. And then, so if I click the arrow, I've got my info open, right? I want this to be unidirectional. So let's take away that pointer. So we're now pointing at the about us. If I want to make it look a little bit fancier, I could do that. And I'm going to just put a label next to that arrow. And it's going to say, this the about us is expandable to, show rest of team, something like that. That's a random thing, right? That I wrote. Probably not something we want to do, but if we wanted to explain what these symbols mean, we could use that, use the arrows to do so. Okay. Now, another thing that we could do is, let's say that we want our slots, only sites with slots open to show up. We could create some sort of maybe checkbox or a switch. So on off switch maybe. So I started searching switch and then that showed up. And then we could put a label next to that that says filter only slots, or filter only open slots. And that would indicate that when this is on, only open slots would filter, right? So that's a simple way of me communicating that I want to do that. Now, in this case, because I do want to show City of Hope, because I want to show what it looks like when there's not a slot open, I'm going to turn this off. So now it's off. And now I just know that if someone were to click this, switch it to on, then it would disappear, right? I don't have to use a switch, right? I could also use maybe a button, could do like a checkbox. Filter only open slots. That's one way to do it. I could also use a radio button. Filter only open slots. So many different ways to do it, just sort of depending on how you want to do it. That's the only thing that matters. You can see using the info panel, I can make this radio button checked. Can make it disabled. Maybe disabled and checked. Same with this one. Disabled and indeterminate, selected, etc. Cool. Mary, did you still have a question? It's your hand
Yeah, I
up.
have a new question.
Mhm.
Is there a more efficient way of putting, like, for lack of better word, like designer notes, or like, you know, when you're writing code, you comment it out so someone you're working with will know what you're doing?
Sure.
And that's kind of like what you're doing with the About Us, but I can see that getting really clunky and like too much information on your, so is there a better way we can put like design comments that go with certain parts?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go to markup, you can see that there's other ways to do this. So I might put this little sticky as an example. And then in the sticky, I could have a lot of information, right? So the About Us should emphasize the, community that we've developed, including users, organizers, leaders, and our internal team, right? Something like that, right? Sort of a longer thing that we want to emphasize. And then they can just double click it to read everything that I've wrote. And that can also be neat because using the stickies, it sort of easily differentiates what is a note from what is actually a part of the wireframe.
Thank you.
Okay. So the most important element is I really want you to highlight the user stories as you're creating your wireframe. And I'd like you to just show how the features that you're building feed into that user story. So what I might write under here is a few bullets of filter by location. I'd also say also filter by open slots. No need to log in might be another example. And I can just expand this so they can see. Oops. And it's sort of up to you whether you want to put it on your slide itself or whether you want to just put it in the notes section. Either one works. It's sort of what is going to work best with your presentation. Okay. And I do have a more thorough run through also posted to the assignment on Canvas. So you'll have that to refer to. I'll just present this. So in terms of assignments, we're going to have the Codecademy assignment. So that'll be HTML lessons 3 through 4. Let me know if you have any issues along the way. And then your wireframe mockup needs to be ready to present in class. What I am really going to be looking for is to list out your functions and importantly, how they address your user stories. I also want to see a minimum of 5 wireframe functions. So, a button and a link and a data input search field, those might count as separate functions, but having 5 different search fields with different labels is not going to count. And then I want to see annotations. You could either use arrows or you could use the stickies. You could also use the notes, but it needs to be communicated effectively, right? So someone who doesn't know what you're talking about needs to be able to look at your wireframe and be able to understand it by looking at the notes that you've put on there. And then describe the use case from start to end. So walk me through the user journey. And I'd like each presentation to go only about 5 minutes because that's really all the time we have with a class this size. I'm going to be grading based on the bullets that are highlighted here, as well as highlighted in the assignment. However, the sort of above and beyond, if you want to go above and beyond, that might help you actually get your wireframe turned into a prototype, if that makes sense. So in some ways, you're trying to sell this both to me in terms of showing that you understand how this works, understand how to build a mock-up, but you're also trying to sell your concept to your peers. Because what we're going to do is we're going to have a peer review for each presentation, and peers will be able to choose which projects they want to work on. And whichever project gets the highest marks, we'll build teams around that based on sort of what your preferences are and which projects were chosen by the peers. Does that make sense? Sort of two elements, right? Showing you know how to build a mock-up and then convincing others to want to join you on your journey. But the convincing others has nothing to do with your grade. So don't worry about that part.
So this is a concept pitch then.
It's simultaneously a concept pitch and showing that you know how to build a wireframe. So showing me that you know how to build a wireframe, showing your peers that you've got a cool concept that's worth working on. Cool. All right. That's it. I'll stick around for the next 10 minutes if anyone has any personal questions. But if not, enjoy your evenings.